Good evening, good evening, good evening. How's everybody feeling? Y'all all right? You good? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. My name is Kalila Bates and I'm the producer here, and I'm standing in for Novella Ford, who is our Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program, Between the Lines, Who Would Believe a Prisoner? With editors Michelle Danielle Jones and Dr. Elizabeth Angeline Nelson. With this work, they pose two questions. What if prisoners were to write the history of their own prison? And what might that tell them and us about the roots of the system that incarcerates so many millions of Americans? Tonight's program is just one of several ways we continue to explore the roots of the U.S. carceral system and interrogate how these systems are built, sustained, and abolished. We are getting down to the last 2 months of our current exhibition, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, curated by Dr. Nicole Fleetwood, who is she may join us later this evening. This exhibition, presented across 3 galleries throughout the Schomburg Center, the Latimer, the Exhibition Hall, and the Media Gallery, highlight artists who have been incarcerated, along with artists who have not been incarcerated, but whose practices expose aspects of the carceral state. Seen together, their works reveal how punitive governance, predatory policy, surveillance, and mass imprisonment impacts millions of people. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, women still represent a larger portion of people in prison and jails than in previous decades. Women's incarceration has grown at twice the pace of men's incarceration in recent decades and has disproportionately been in local jails. Marking Time features artists across the gender spectrum, with women presenting art for empowerment, commerce, and witness. I invite you to take some time to explore Marking Time during our exhibition hours, and for a short while after this program, the 3 spaces will be open, but that's after you buy your book and get your book signed. We also invite you to join us on Saturday, November 4th at the Schomburg Center's annual open house. And this is a time where you can tour and experience 3 artists working in response to our Marking Time exhibition. The open house is an invitation to discover the Schomburg through curator-led presentations, unique activations, tours, workshops with the Healing Project and artists like Shani Jamila, and we're going to be screening the film Beat Street. So if you saw that when it was fresh, come see it again on the big screen here at the Schomburg Center. Our full schedule will be available online tomorrow, so make sure you visit Eventbrite to see that. If this is your first time at the Schomburg Center, Open House is a perfect return trip to experience more. You can visit our website at schomburg.org to stay informed about upcoming programs, digital and in-person exhibitions, and the latest in research and collections. So just a bit of housekeeping. We ask you to take this time to silence your cell phones. And if you're looking to share tonight's program with others, it can be viewed on our YouTube channel, which youtube.com/the Schomburg Center, in the coming days. All right, for tonight, Michelle Danielle Jones and Dr. Elizabeth Angeline Nelson are editors of Who Would Believe a Prisoner? Indiana Women's Carceral Institutions, 1848 through 1920. In this groundbreaking regulatory volume, a group of incarcerated women at the Indiana State Prison have assembled a chronicle of what was originally known as the Indiana Reformatory Institute for Women and Girls, founded in 1873 as the first totally separate prison for women in the United States. The Indiana Women's Prison History Project worked under conditions of sometimes extreme duress, excavating documents, navigating doctrine limitations on what information incarcerated scholars could see or access. and grappling with the unpredicated challenges stemming from co-authors living on either side of the prison walls. So with us, who just sat with us today, we have Dr. Elizabeth Nelson. She's an assistant professor in the Medical Humanities Health Studies program at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and an adjunct assistant professor at the Africana Studies in history. Nelson earned a PhD in French history at Indiana University, Bloomington in 2015, and served as the director of public programs at the Indiana Medical History Museum from 2014 to 2017. A medical historian, Nelson's primary research interests center on the United States and France. She explores how people carve out bold and meaningful lives in the most inhospitable spaces. Nelson is currently working on a collaborative book project on the final years of the closure of the Indiana Central State Hospital, inspired by newsletters published by patients with intellectual disabilities in the late 1980s. Since 2018, she has coordinated the Indiana Women's Prison History Project and is co-editor with Michelle Daniel Jones of the collection we are talking about tonight, Who Would Believe a Prisoner? Indiana Women's Carceral Institution. Okay, so give it up for Dr. Nelson. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Michelle Daniel Jones with us. She is the 6-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University. Her dissertation focuses on creative liberation strategies of incarcerated women and the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. As an organizer, collaborator, and subject matter expert, she creates opportunities to speak truth to power and serves in the development and operation of task force and initiatives to reduce harm and end mass incarceration. She has joined Second Chance Educational Alliance as a senior research consultant, the Women's Transcending Oral History Project at Columbia University Center for Justice, the Survivors Justice Project, and serves on the boards of Worth Rises and the Correctional Association of New York. She is founding member of the board president of the Constructing Our Future, a reentry and housing organization for women created by incarcerated women in the Indiana and Beyond the Bars Fellow. A research fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and a Ford Foundation Bearing Witness Fellow at the Art for Justice, among many other roles. As an artist, further, Danielle Jones is interested in finding ways to funnel her research pursuits into theater, dance, and photography. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with us this evening. I will turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So thank you all for being here. This is really, it's an amazing place and an amazing opportunity to talk to you guys about the book. Dr. Nelson and I were very excited when the Schomburg said, hey, come over here.
Yes.
So we're excited to talk to you about this book. I have my clicker, and we have slides that we'll show here at the top. And beginning, I just want you to see the women who are in our project, right? This project has 10 women as authors in it, right? Some of us are still incarcerated, and some of us are out. But I want to say their names because they're amazing people who took their heart and soul into this project. Don't respect my authority, clicker. And so we have Anastasia Schmid, Christina Kovacs, that's Dr. Nelson there, and Kim Baldwin, Laura Campbell, that's me, Michelle Williams, Molly Whitted, Natalie Medley, Nicole Davis, Rayanne Kelly, and then there was a community of scholars who participated in the project, being on the research side because it was actually an undergraduate course. and we'll get more into how it went from an undergraduate course one semester into a full book today. So.
Absolutely. So I came into the project a bit later, so we might save that for
Sure.
for a little bit later.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the project began back in, what was it, 2013-ish?
2015.
Okay.
2015.
Okay.
So Dr. Kelsey Kaufman came to fill a role once college was removed from Indiana State prisons writ large in 2012, and we had nothing. And so she organized volunteer faculty and retired faculty to come in and offer credited programs. And in addition to that, was creating that curriculum for each semester. And she got together with those faculty members and decided it would be great to write the history of the facility in which we were located in. And she imagined it would take one semester to write a history, and we would come up with a nice pamphlet that we could say, look what we can do, right? But once we got into the project, I mean, doing a deep dive on the minds and the thinking of these women, and when they decided to create the first public prison for women in the United States, it expanded from one semester to 2 semesters. The undergraduates had to go on, and all of us who had bachelor's degrees or associate's degrees who were already done with our educational pursuits, we were able to stay with the program and go further with it. And that started in 2015. Wow, It's just like, wow. A lot has happened. And so the book asks the question, did you know that historians recognize that the women's prison is the first separate prison for women in the United States? Prior to its opening, women were incarcerated with men inside the Jeffersonville facility in their own department. Under this situation, women were subjected to sexual and gender violence. Children were born in this place. Guards had full use of the women for $10 a month. They would pay the warden. And it was a brutal place, but there were no other places for women who were convicted of crimes in courts to go. So they went to Jeffersonville. And so the facility the first facility in this book that we discuss opened in 1873, removing 18 women from the men's facility into a separate facility created for women.
Do you want to read about Ava?
I'm going to read about Ava right about now.
Okay, yeah.
So those are our two, and I'm using air quotes, benevolent prison reformers, because they were Quaker missionaries who went inside Jeffersonville and exposed the sexual violence that was going on. And with that, I would love to take a moment and read to you Ava's story from chapter 1. So Coffin, the photo that we saw before, is the woman on the left. Coffin saw that rape and sexual violations were easy and frequent at Jeffersonville, and that the all-male staff worked together to tyrannize and silence the women. 26 women were incarcerated there between 1823, the year that the first matron, Mary Johnson, was hired, and 1859. The matron locked the women in the female department at night, but she did not reside on grounds and was therefore unable to protect the women in her charge. Colonel J.B. Merriweather, the prison's warden from 1865 to 1868, was abusive, often inebriated, and just as culpable as his subordinates. He instituted the practice of keeping a mistress in the female department, a practice that the officers and guards quickly imitated. As a result, women lived under the constant threat of violations and violence. Harry Bonka, incarcerated at Jeffersonville from 1868 to 1871, described how Merriweather commanded a young woman working in his residence to sing for him. When she refused, the outraged warden left to retrieve his cat o' nine tails. It was only the intervention of the warden's wife that prevented the assault. According to Bonka, Merriweather shamelessly charged the prison officials $10 a month for open-ended use of the women in the female department. One prison official who took advantage of Merriweather's offer was the hospital steward, Joe Vanoy. In addition, when a staff member discovered Merriweather sexually assaulting a woman in her cell, the employee received a sudden promotion ensuring his silence. Allegation in the local news that the warden practiced concubinage in the facility recast the prison into a vast bawdy house, or brothel. In 1866, a young woman named Ava Green entered Jeffersonville and was immediately set on by the hospital steward, Joe Vanoy. Banka described Ava as a very beautiful girl. Vanoy took advantage of Meriwether's open season and coerced and then blackmailed Ava into frequent sexual intercourse with him in the doctor's office. To Ava's horror, he infected her with a sexually transmitted disease, most likely syphilis. The disease caused lesions and scarring on her face and body. Once Ava was infected, Vanoy discarded her. Before Ava's release in 1868, covered with the external marks of her disgrace and smarting from the keenest of anguish, that's a quote, she sat and wrote a complete account of Vanoy's abuses and demanded an investigation, with her physical body as the evidence, and she was not denied. At the trial, Ava presented her case. Standing before the prison directors, she revealed that Vanoy infected her with the loathsome disease, which festered and covered almost her entire person with putrid sores, and she was no longer beautiful. Several other Jeffersonville women testified about Vanoy's deeds and stood with Ava for justice. According to Banka, the women convinced the prison board of directors of the hospital of Stewart's guilt. Vanoy repeatedly hung his head between his legs as Ava bared her disfigured face and pointed at him. Eviscerated with guilt from her, quote, simple but truthful tale, Vanoy asked to leave, yet he was cleared by the directors. This is not surprising. Colonel Meriwether, the warden, was Vanoy's counsel in the presentation before the board of directors. And two of the directors were also lawyers. Meriwether summed up Vanoy's argument against Ava with a resounding imperative. You can't believe that woman. Caught her in 1,000 lies. The gavel sounded to deny justice for Ava, and it echoes through time as the carceral system continues to strip confined women of their personhood, to deny them justice, and to invalidate their experiences. And that's where the title of this book would come from. So to that point, the exposure from this situation that Sarah and Rhoda discovered, they took it to Governor Conrad Baker, and he and them lobbied to get a new prison built for women in Indianapolis. And Sarah Smith, on the right, was named as superintendent. And she had a history of also working with this population, and she had founded a couple of homes for friendless women in Indiana. Respect my authority, there we go. So this is a picture of the actual facility once it was built. It was not to Sarah Smith's design. She wanted the building separate so that she could have the women separated from the girls. This co-ed facility held women incarcerated who were convicted of crimes from county courts, as well as holding women and girls who were young girls who were sent there from their counties as well for rehabilitation. And so the reformatory's ideology was, women had few opportunities to earn a wage during this time. This is after the Civil War. This is after, several of their brothers, fathers, sons, husbands were killed. They didn't have access to the same opportunities to make money. At this time, women weren't allowed to own property. And so sex work, theft, fraud was a path that some women took to survive, dealing with marginal conditions as they were. And the reformatory believed that their situations were more a result of laziness and a lack of willpower and godlessness, right? So their goal was to indoctrinate these women and get them to ascribe to middle-class standards and ideals, middle-class standards and ideals. But as our book tells you, the reformatory was just as bad for the women as the men's prison was, right? Because women who were deemed fallen and ruined, they were not ascribed full personhood of woman. And so lots of things were allowed to happen to those women inside the prison. We found great evidence of being waterboarded, being beaten, being fed bread and water diets. We found evidence of being locked in closets and beaten while naked. So some of the actions that happened in these facilities were highly sexualized. And I'll get to the methodology section where I talk about how we pushed them to find this, because our original archivist believed we were writing the feel-good story of the year about these amazing reformers who came and took the women from the Jeffersonville facility and created this really nice facility for women and took really good care of them. Yet we found, because we did not believe that holistic story, we sent them back to the archives because we were like, there are glaring errors in the archive, in the information that we had, and we sent them back, and then they came back with the evidence of an investigation that resulted in telling the story that Sarah, as a leader, and these other people were punishing these girls for any expression of their sex and sexuality, for masturbation, for being rude or sassy, and the ways in which they told to reform or rehabilitate these women were just as violent in many ways as it was in the men's facilities. And of course, like many places at the time, prisons were needing. The ideology is that a prison should be self-sufficient. It should be able to run on its own, take care of all of its needs on its own. And so like a lot of prisons of the day, the women worked laborious, horrible hours in the laundry on grounds, washing the laundry of the entire areas around the facility. Chapters by Kim Baldwin, Molly Wooded, and Michelle Williams in this book really go into the economic exploitation that was at the heart of these ventures. And so with that, I'll pass to Dr. Nelson.
So thinking back to around maybe 2016 or so, I had recently gotten my PhD. I was working at the Indiana Medical History Museum, and I was reading a history publication, Perspectives Magazine, and I came across this piece by Michelle talking about the work that they were doing in the classroom at the Indiana Women's Prison to uncover the history of the prison, and as we'll talk about, related institutions in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And it was a call for help, for volunteers in the Indianapolis area to help out with this research. The student scholars who are part of this program depended on people on the outside to field their research requests, kind of interpret their research questions, and go into local libraries and archives. We also, befriended a whole network of archivists and librarians in the area in order to make this happen. And so I started doing that here and there, bringing in research materials, and got to know a little bit about the process. And you all were also beginning to kind of make a name for yourself in the academic community, but also other programs and higher education in prison were looking to the research that was happening here, because something special was happening. You all were able to create opportunities to really speak to the public about your findings, to use video conferencing equipment to present at conferences like the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians and other academic venues. So this was something that was appealing to me to be in support of. When the original founder of the project, Kelsey Kaufman,
That's her on the right there.
there she is, yes. Okay, yeah, I should say a little bit about this picture. Yeah, so Kelsey's there in the blue t-shirt on the right. And this is a group of people that, kind of assembled to make this book happen. So I have a couple of student research assistants, Marlene Weska and Monica Deck on the left there with the red hair. That's Anastasia Schmid, who is one of the book's authors, and Molly Whitted is next to her. Both of them had been recently released from prison, and so this was kind of a celebratory moment to have folks be able to be, meeting and working on the book on the outside. We have Nicole Siegel, who's a professor at IU Bloomington, and then of course Michelle is there as well. Gosh, where was I? What should I say? Let's see what's on the next slide. So one of the things that, so once Kelsey left for California, she invited me to kind of take over that role of coordinator, which was a multifaceted role. A lot of it was initially before I was able, I got some grant money to hire some students to help out, but in the beginning, I was the one going into the libraries and scanning documents. And
The Art for Justice Fund helped a lot with that.
yes, must mention Art for Justice, absolutely. And so the logistics of this were formidable, right? In order to kind of replicate a good portion of these archival sources and to bring them into the prison. And then keep track of where they were. This was not a simple task, but also given my background, as my training as a historian and my knowledge of the archive system and my writing ability as well, to mentor the students as they were in kind of workshop chapters with each student. So I walked into the classroom in early 2018 when most everyone was still inside except for you. Michelle was the first of this group to be released. I had a classroom of, I think, 8 students at that time, and we just went in often and got the work going. What you saw happening was, as the project expanded, the women began to specialize in different aspects of the history. Many of the women were kind of driven in their choice of research topics by personal experiences and finding things in the historical record that resonated with things that they'd been through themselves. Here's a couple of pictures from the Indiana Girls' School from the early 20th century, which was an institution that split off from that initial reformatory to become a kind of separate juvenile facility.
Like Sarah Smith actually got her wish. They actually separated the adults from
Exactly.
the young women, young girls and teens.
Yeah, exactly. And so Lisa Hostettler and Nicole Hayes were researchers who were both interested in that facility. And Lisa's work in particular, she was very interested in the girls who came in pregnant and what happened to their babies. And this relationship that the juvenile facility had with orphanages. And Lisa was really driven in many ways by her own experience of being separated from her children, seeing them go through, in some cases, foster care. And so you saw, women kind of gravitating toward different aspects of this history. Can we go to the next slide? We also began, you all had already begun this by the time I came on board, but you all were discovering that there were other institutions besides the official public, state-run prison that were incarcerating women in the Indianapolis area at the same time, and even earlier. So Michelle and Lori Record wrote a very kind of groundbreaking piece on the system of of houses. They're called houses of the Good Shepherd, which were Catholic-run institutions, of which there are a couple dozen by the end of the 19th century, scattered all around the United States. You also could find them in Canada, Australia, all over the world, and very analogous to what have been called Magdalen laundries in the context of Ireland and Irish history. So places where women or girls who were engaging in or in danger of engaging in any kind of sexual contact outside of a marriage would be brought in either by police or by parents, by priests, and held
even
there.
more than that.
Yeah.
Women were locked up in these Magdalene laundries for those reasons, but also if they were pregnant, had a child out of wedlock, fell in love with somebody that they didn't want them to be in love with, and even if they were too pretty, that they were at risk for becoming something because they were deemed too beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, these institutions, there's one in Buffalo, one of the ones that comes to mind is one that was in Buffalo, New York, right? It literally had electric barbed wire on the fence of the home. It looked like any home in any neighborhood in the world, but there was barbed wire on the fence, and then on the actual windows of the houses on the roofs.
Yeah.
They were like, these were prisons, right? So whatever the benevolent or an original orientation, they operated like prisons.
Yeah, and so that was what your article that you wrote with Lori claimed, and I think very successfully argued, is that these kinds of private-run homes, quote-unquote, houses, ought to be included in our conception of the history of prisons writ large. Yeah. And so you saw then some of the students in the class began to specialize in that institution and different aspects of that. So we have 4 chapters in the book by various authors listed here. Christina, Natalie, Rayanne, and Lara each contributed a chapter about a different aspect of the Indianapolis House of the Good Shepherd. And you see many of the same themes that Michelle was talking about: economic exploitation, various forms of physical and sexual abuse happening here as well. And so you see this kind of public-private, there's differences in the structures, but also some really important commonalities.
Yeah. So this is Anna, yeah? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I can say a couple things as well. So one of the more shocking findings in the research was the work of our colleague Anastasia Schmid, who was interested in the medical context. Oh, we went too far.
Yeah.
The medical context inside the prison, and particularly the work of the prison's physician, Theophilus Parvin. So he was or became a specialist in gynecology and obstetrics during his time at the prison, and Anastasia was very suspicious of this, right? Like, why, there has to be some kind of relationship with his research interests and then publications that are based on extensive experimentation and study of women's bodies.
Right, because he was the president of the AMA at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a very prestigious, position and job, and you go to work in a prison. Like, what's your motivation? Yeah. Right. And so that's what she was pulling on. She was like, presidents of the AMA don't typically go work in prisons. Right. Something's up. But go ahead.
And so she was, suspected. Her hypothesis was that he was using the women's bodies inside the prison as fodder for his research. And it was difficult going, and there was some skepticism from others about whether or not that seemed just such a egregious and radical thing to happen. But Anna was able to prove it. She looked at the prison's annual reports and wasn't able to, it was very minimal in what he was reporting on in terms of his medical work with women incarcerated there. But then when she looked at his scientific papers, the kind of addresses, presentations he would do for his medical colleagues, then all of a sudden there was the evidence. Parvin was also very much driven by a kind of puritanical ideology and a religious ideology and a gender ideology that posited that any woman who was displaying any kind of sexual desire or pleasure in sexuality that she was diseased. It was a sign of pathology. There was something wrong with her. And so he was very interested in researching nymphomania, which he saw as a serious and particularly female pathology. And the ways that he would do his investigations were incredibly disgusting. So he would basically digitally rape women, and if they responded in any way, that would be proof of her pathology, right? Lots of experimentations
then to control that. And one of his major reports talked about the use of cocaine on women's vulva and clitoris in order to control what he considered women's desires. Women should not have sexual desires of any kind. And so controlling them through these treatments was how he viewed women's bodies. And I mean, the narrations in the research are profound.
Right.
I mean, and he went on to publish a book.
Yeah.
A tome this thick on a gynecology obstetrics with very detailed drawings of female anatomy in his studies. But you want to talk about Marion Sims? Yeah. So
because
these are New
exactly
Yorkers; they know who Marion Sims is.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that Anna does with her chapter, which I think is really, really strong and really compelling, is the comparison that she makes between Theophilus Parvin and his predecessor in gynecology, J. Marion Sims, who many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, who did experimental surgeries on enslaved women in the 1840s, and then built his career, ultimately came to New York, and was also president of the American Medical Association and a founder of the modern field of gynecology. Deirdre Cooper Owens is a historian who's done a really groundbreaking work on him. And Anna places Parvin next to Sims and kind of sees him as a counterpart and a successor to Sims' legacy, and using the captive body as the grounds for the creation of medical knowledge and the building of this specialty.
Because you're thinking about it like this: after slavery ended, what's the next captive, cordoned off population that's available behind closed doors for experimentation? That next population is incarcerated women.
Yeah.
Particularly at a time when they got separated into their own facility just for women. They're no longer under the auspices of a co-ed facility. I mean, it was primed in a lot of ways for him to take advantage of that.
And the next slide, please. One of the other chapters, so another chapter that kind of deals with the history of medicine in the context of women's carceral institutions was Molly Whitted's chapter, which is focusing on the very early 20th century, so toward the beginning of the era of eugenics and the control of populations through controlling who can have children or not. And Indiana is notorious for having passed the first eugenical sterilization law in 1907, the first one in the whole country. And so a lot of the historians of eugenics in Indiana have focused on sterilization, which is a very interesting and very important history.
Yeah. I mean, Indiana has that, right? And then
Yeah.
KKK and eugenics
Yeah.
history. I mean, Indiana's like the main site for like a lot of this stuff.
But what Molly was interested in was incarceration itself as a form of eugenics. So, you know, keeping women of childbearing age out of the general population and unable to reproduce. And she looks at a law that was passed in 1901 by the Indiana State Legislature to they put money aside to build a ward essentially at the School for Feeble-Minded Youth, quote unquote, feeble-minded youth in Fort Wayne, which was in northern Indiana. They built a special ward for women who were considered feeble-minded and who were deemed unworthy of reproduction. And so they could be kept for the entirety of, you know, of their childbearing years, so in decades potentially until menopause. And so this was a practice that continued for decades in Indiana alongside sterilization as a eugenic practice.
Yeah. And so in general, like gender responsive carceral systems, I mean, they criminalize women and women's bodies, period, full stop.
Okay, and that was actually the last slide.
That was
Yeah,
last
this was
slide,
this last one was a mistake, but this is more from Parvin if you are
Where he talks
curious.
about injuries and diseases in
Yeah.
female genitals. So there's a couple big lessons that we can take away from doing this history project. Obviously, the initial premise of women being in charge of incarcerating women and creating a better cage to incarcerate women is a false premise. That doesn't work because what we found is that violence is constitutive of the prison. You cannot have a prison without violence. And so if it's violent, it doesn't help us. It's not helping women at all. Another key thing that, so all those gender reformed ideas, we gotta be really careful about how much we ascribe to gendered ideas of incarceration when we know that violence is at the root of how you do incarceration. We learned another initial premise is that, this idea that women have to be caged in order to be helped. The Magdalene Laundries, the reformer, they had to encage women in order to be helped. The first prison for women in the United States had to be caged in order to be helped. These home for friendless women were prisons and had to cage women in order to be helped. These feeble-minded homes, we've got to cage you, lock you up in order to help you. Like, that's a complete and total false premise, right? And I will read the statement that I've wrote about heterotopic spaces. Heterotopic spaces are spaces that cordon off certain populations that are considered deviant and considered on the outside of regular society. And they're cordoned off in such a way so that we can look at them and say, oh, at least I'm not them. At least we're not like those people, right? So the heterotopic spaces of secrecy are out without real oversight and transparency to balance these unequal power dynamics that are like inherent in these systems. They are spaces that are history about the first institutions for women in the country, right? We show that they are rooted in gendered and sexual violence from the root, right? But then now I'm gonna move into the methodology, right? Because we talked a little bit about like how we did this. We believe that incarcerated scholars are uniquely positioned to do research about prisons, on prisons and other carceral systems in which they are caged because of their orientation to the archive. They know what it's like to be captive, they know what it's like to be caged, so there's a different way in which we read the archive than other historians who've written books about prisons, or other historians who didn't have that lived experience. So it provides us an a valuable insider critique. In our project, we knew the right questions to ask because they came a bit out of our own lived experience. You know, we talked about Molly's experience. We talked about Anastasia's experience. Her personal experience with medicalization in the county jail moved her to literally butt heads with our faculty person who was like, you can't say that, Dr. Parfin didn't do that. And she's like, I know he did. Go back to the archive and find it. She said, because I am those women. I am them, right? That's something that when she talks about it still gives me chills because she was abused in her county jail, right? We asked questions up until that point of the data that was out there that other historians had not. And so as a result, taken after several years of like watching our processes, the chapter in this book called The Methodology is suggesting to us a different methodology called the embodied observer. The embodied observer is someone who is coming from their lived experience under captivity, be that detention centers, asylums, mental hospitals where they're locked in and they can't get out, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, and other mental health institutions. We're trying to say that those people, that reality of being captive provides a certain insight on how to look at the systems of incarceration uniquely. And so you should epistemically privilege our viewpoint, because typically our position to be a knower of our own experience is epistemically denied. Typically, you're an incarcerated person, you don't know what you need. You don't need to be at the table when we come up with this reentry program. You don't know nothing. You don't know what you need in terms of trying to reunify with your children. You don't know anything. So we say privilege our experience of incarceration because we use it as one of the lenses in which to approach the archive, and that is value added, right? Because what are we doing? We're unearthing what Foucault calls subjugated knowledge. Subjugated knowledge that is not a part of the dominant narrative that is told about prisons. If you read anything about these folks who created these institutions, you will hear and learn a very glowing, all perfect, benevolent story. But the truth of the matter is, humanity is a lot more complex. And our book is designed to be read alongside your dominant narratives to complicate the narrative of the benevolent anything. The benevolent anything that has an unequal power dynamic against other human beings in any system. Yeah.
So I would like to read a little bit from, let me make sure we have time, from the afterword of the book, because this was an opportunity for me to reflect on just kind of my experience with the project, but also okay, now that it's done, now that the book is, after all of these years, right, what does it mean and what does it matter? There's something alluring about the idea of an all-woman renegade prison history collective writing a book. I admit that allure is part of the reason I find myself here as co-editor of this collection, despite having little experience of incarceration myself. As a historian of psychiatry who studies institutions of confinement like mental hospitals, I was thrilled that my expertise allowed me to lend support to a project as exciting as this one. The scholarship in this volume exposes the gendered violence at the origins of the United States system of mass incarceration and represents a vanguard of historical scholarship produced by incarcerated people themselves. It also charts new territory for histories of human subjects research in medicine, as well as histories of eugenics and reproductive justice. This book should prompt readers to consider the symbiotic relations grounding the development of institutions in so-called modern America. The interconnections between the carceral and the medical, for example, and the knitted relationships among a variety of public and private establishments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including prisons, poorhouses, brothels, orphanages, asylums, hospitals, and homes for quote-unquote fallen women. I suggest we also take a critical look at how educational institutions such as colleges and universities interact with prisons today, as these relationships can sometimes become too comfortable. In my short time in this field, I've witnessed growing excitement about the possibilities of prison education and have been privy to growing partnerships between prisons and institutions of higher education that are often well-meaning. However, the perceived sexiness of such programming, along with the financial motivations brought about by recent Pell Grant reforms, should give us pause. The Indiana Women's Prison History Project is badass. These scholars are badass, but we shouldn't get lost in the word prison. Michelle Daniel Jones presents a new term here, the embodied observer, one who views the archive from the position of the captive, from the inside of their experience. The author's lived experience as prisoners does give them incomparable insight into the history of incarcerating women in Indiana. But that experience belongs to them. Only they can claim it. We must not credit the prison for this book or use it as a defense of prison education. We also shouldn't be so entranced that this book was written by lady murderers and thieves inside the slammer. This isn't Chicago the musical. In addition, while we celebrate the triumph this book represents and the remarkable accomplishments of these scholars, we should remember that writing this book has not set its authors free from stigma, from surveillance, from difficulties accessing housing and employment,
Amen.
From intimate partner violence, from addiction, from post-traumatic prison disorder, or from the heartbreak of being separated from and reunited or not with their children.
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, for those still inside, writing this book has not freed them from incarceration itself.
Right.
Higher education in prison, uncoupled from the work of abolition, is a red herring. Don't get me wrong, I am all for education inside prison, but the meat of it must be separated from the so-called rehabilitative logic of the prison itself. The prison did not provide the foundation for the writing of this book, even if it was possible to negotiate with prison administrators for limited access to necessary resources. The prison did not grant these authors opportunities to pursue higher education after release. These are pathways that these scholars and their allies carved out for themselves. Operating the Indiana Women's Prison History Project as part of the prison's higher education programming was an act of strategy, a shell game that involved certain risks. The writing of this book was at heart a clandestine and subversive operation.
Yeah.
In the acts of researching, thinking, and writing, the authors claimed moments of fugitivity that are part of the long game of liberation.
Yeah.
This is a book that was created in a prison, but it is not of it. I'm not fundamentally opposed to programs that can offer opportunities to earn college degrees. Those can make a real difference in the life trajectories of post-incarcerated people. But we must remember that any higher education that happens inside a prison happens despite the fact that it's happening inside a prison. That is not to say that one doesn't learn something very fundamental and very shocking about the world by being in one, even as a visitor. And there is something about the stillness of the air in a prison and the austerity of it that makes the classroom crackle. I too am tempted to romanticize it. But the fact is this book was an enormous pain in the ass to put together because we had to field each scholar's research requests, ferry in loads of scanned documents from multiple libraries and archives, and then try to keep track of them. This was necessary because the authors of this book were being kept in a cage, an immense pastoral cage with a chapel in the center. What this group of scholars was able to achieve despite such conditions is astonishing. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. That's good. I did a whole bunch of nodding to my head. So with that, we are open to questions and Q&A, and there's a microphone and things. So yes, please feel free. We're here. We're open. You read the best part.
Thank you. Thank you both for your talk. My name is Phil Campbell. I'm a Hunter College student. Actually, planning for grad school, getting a PhD in American Studies.
Okay.
And I spent the summer researching the 135th Street Library as a heterotopic space. So I'm extremely excited to ask, but one of the things I'm looking at in my research is following the strain of the Black National Anthem and lifting every voice, Mm-hmm. I'm researching 1920s and the way this library was reoriented. And, my mentors keep telling me it's not me talking, it's, me talking, or me finding the voices of the people who was at the library. So
Yeah.
can you guys talk about more lifting the voices of those people through archival research
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the methodology through which you did that?
Yeah, yeah, okay, that's really good. That's really great. So, yeah, the book is oriented to lead off with the stories of women, right? Stories that weren't told in any other Indiana history archive before. We pulled these things together with a certain consciousness that we were piecing bits of human stories together, right? So a piece of an article over here, we traced and found, the Parvin story. We saw that the white women were identified with just initials, and the black women were identified by their names. And what we saw in there was that their initials and their names looked similar to what we saw in the registry, and then we were able to prove that he was publishing his stories and his research about his work at the prison by close reading of the archive that we were creating. And I think that orienting the stories around the women was really grounding for us, right? Ava's story is taken almost whole cloth from Banca's story, but because we had enough understanding of the context of the time, I was able to critique that space, right? As opposed to just, here's a story that Banca told. No, Dr. Nelson, Dr. Kaufman brought in a lot of secondary sources for us to understand the lay of the land in context of the time. So now I'm able to understand more about what Ava is living in and going through, right? And so that's how you make the stories of the people live, by really grounding yourself in the context of the time, and you lift out the pieces of the individual stories through that. I mean, there's some amazing people who do that historically, who are like my heroes, my sheroes. Callie Gross does that with her practice of informed speculation. We're piecing together stories of Black women and other women's stories, indigenous women, immigrant women whose voices were undervalued. So they're not captured whole cloth in the archive, right? They're just not there. And so you have to understand the context of the time and lift up the pieces that you can see and show them for us in context. Informed speculation, Callie Gross,
Cynthia Hartman has
Cynthia
been
Hartman,
huge.
Talitha LaFloria has an amazing methodology around that. Sarah Haley does as well. So we read that, the theory and the context of the time, and lifted up the women's stories through that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I just want to add too that, it's also very tricky when often in our case, for example, for the fragments that you do have, these archival pieces, are coming from the point of view of the prison,
right.
or you're just getting a record of this person at the lowest point of their life, when they're being, when violence is being enacted upon them. And then how do you, and again, Cynthia Hartman, I'm just thinking about her work, Venus in Two Acts, and Wayward Lives, all of her work has been really, really special for me and for our whole group. But how to do this ethically, right? And not perpetuate that exploitation. And so we were really careful with, how we told these stories, and also bringing a critical eye to these documents, but also ultimately believing the women that we were looking at. For example, a lot of the sources that we found on the House of the Good Shepherd had been dismissed by prior historians who saw them as part of these sensational tales that were part of Protestant and anti-Catholic propaganda that painted these kinds of homes as hellholes where people were being tortured. And there was some sensationalism. There was some, fake news out there. But, Laura Campbell, for example, who wrote about 2 women who were inmates there, incarcerated there, she said, well, what if we start by assuming that they're telling the truth, but also doing the work of kind of triangulation. So she says this here, and this is corroborated when I look at these newspaper reports about girls jumping out of the window and breaking their arms or even falling to their deaths trying to escape this place. And when I go to the Archdiocese archives, their own archives, right?
Right.
It matches, the accounts match.
Yeah.
And so being able to validate some of those voices retrospectively, I think has been important.
And looking at non-traditional sources. I mean, we all look at newspaper accounts and things like that. But one of the things that I appreciated, which Dr. Nelson took me, is to sit in the archive itself and think about how records are kept about spaces. What other ways are spaces, institutions documented? So I found corroboration for some of my stuff by going to the legislature's General Assembly notes, because they had done the investigations in Jeffersonville and done the investigations in the women's prison, and they had to talk about it in the General Assembly notes. Well, most people wouldn't think to go there to look for corroboration and triangulation, but you got that's where that savvy comes in, right? So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, I wonder what was going on in Indiana at that
Ma'am, I'm sorry. Ma'am, it's the root. It's the root of a lot of shenanigans and malarkey.
But had it anything to do with homesteading and the orphan trains, where children were taken from their families, especially from New York, but by priests, by Catholic Church, and literally farmed out across the country as invaders moved across the country to occupy indigenous lands.
Right.
And so I think a lot of people were displaced.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
didn't know who they were anymore, had no
Yeah.
connections to it. And all sorts of things can happen. But one of the incarceral systems that we live with, and I was a part of, was foster care. Okay, and incarcerates the women and the children.
Yes.
And that's right in front of our faces.
Right.
And when I had to write down embodied observers, because after my mother died, my mother died, I started talking about the fact that I had been a foster child. And I'm an adult at that point, and people started trying to deny what I said. They kept telling me, well, no, it couldn't have been like that, or no, I know somebody who, okay.
Right.
And I realized, okay, this is why I never talked about it before, because I wasn't believed, and it's supposed to be a good thing.
Right.
And so people do not want to hear, okay, what it actually looks like. And that's when I realized that it was an incarcerating system. And so I started being an advocate for mothers, especially mothers, but parents whose kids were in foster care, and started working to get them out. Okay? And it was very difficult.
Yeah.
We'd go to court with them. Because the system did everything to keep these families apart.
Yeah.
And in a very insidious way, especially, and I worked with mainly African American families, so I'm going to talk about that aspect of it, is that these children would be taken away from their families and given to other families, okay, who had a monetary interest in keeping these children away from their families. And that was on purpose.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I was a victim of just that, okay? Where the system would believe what the caregiver said, even when, and I'm too young to no one would listen to me to say that that's not true.
Right.
Okay? And so the system insisted on incarceration because it was profitable.
Yep.
And incarceration everywhere is profitable.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just needed to get that out there because you just brought that up.
Thank you. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you for that.
Hi, so my name is Selena, and I'm formerly incarcerated. And what made me come here tonight is because I was looking through the Schomburg website, and I seen the title, Who's Gonna Believe a Prisoner? And I was like, wait a minute, okay, I need to go there. Because, so when I was in prison, upstate New York, when I went into prison, I had a hernia. And so I wasn't allowed to work. And you know, in prison, it's mandated to work. And the only way you don't work, it has to be something, you know, serious. So anyway, I had a like a golf ball size hernia. So they didn't allow me to work. And so they sent me into the infirmary. And so while I was in the infirmary, you know, in prison, the main line is, what you in here for? What are you here for? What are you here for? So in the infirmary, it's the same thing. Everybody's like, what you here for? What you here for? And so I was shocked because it was so many women in there. And when you ask them what you're here for, they would say, I had a hysterectomy. So I was like, oh, okay. You know, they found some cancerous something. Like, okay. So that was like the first woman. And then the second woman, what are you here for? Hysterectomy. And then, like, after a while, I started really getting scared. I was like, uh-oh. Like, they are literally taking the uterus out of these women. And then what I noticed was that the women were young, you know, childbearing age. And so I didn't have to worry then because I was a little bit past that. Well, not really, but I was like in my 40s. I guess that was too old because most of the women were 20s, you know, childbearing age. And it just shocked me that all these women had hysterectomies.
Well,
And
you see, the book gives you that long history that's been a
Yeah.
practice for a long time.
Yeah, so it's been practiced right here in New York as well, in New York
Yes. Oh,
State.
yes.
And when I came home and I was telling people about it, people was like, oh, you know, you got that conspiracy theory thing going on, and like, who's gonna believe a prisoner? And so it never went nowhere. But I wish somebody would write a book like that about upstate
Yes,
prisons.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And thank you for your book.
Hi, my name is Mari Moss. First of all, I want to say thank you for this discussion. I want to say thank you for even the experiences that you all took upon yourselves to delve into this history, to bring it to us, to make more of the population more aware. I'm very devastated to hear about how, you know, really women have been objectified through the prison and carceral system so devastatingly. I'm thinking about humanitarian, like, where is the humanity? Where are the humanitarian efforts that are supposed to protect women and children, and from what we're hearing in this, like, where were they then? And where are they now? That's my biggest question. Like, proactively today, what are the movements? What are the organizations? Who are the people that are keeping this from happening today?
Right.
Because if we can learn anything from history, it's to not repeat the negative aspects of it. And that's the thing that we need to look forward to even now. With the woman who was speaking today about foster care, the foster care system, and how there are moneyed parties that are put in place to separate families.
Yes.
You know, and it's a nefarious thing, but where are the ethical organizations? Where are the humanitarian organizations? Where are those entities that are to protect the people's rights? Because people have rights.
Right.
And they need to be known, they need to know what their rights are so that they can overcome the obstacles that are placed before them. So
Right.
that is my question.
Yeah, okay, so I think I'll start first and talk about external oversight mechanisms. First of all, because the service industry does not make money, the service industry doesn't get funded, right? So resources to help those mothers and babies and children, are always going to be underfunded, stripped of fund, because they don't make money, right? In the same way as, say, economic exploitation going on inside a prison. But let's talk about external oversight mechanisms. People who are supposed to keep eyes on humanitarian efforts inside prisons to make sure, you know, sexual and gendered violence and abuses don't occur, right? There's only 3 in the country, and they only have recommendation power. The one in New York is the Correctional Association of New York, where I'm on the board. In Illinois, there's the John Howard Association, and in Philadelphia, there's the Philadelphia Prison Association. The Correctional Association of New York. And these wonderful entities, the only external oversight mechanisms we have in the country that are nonpartisan, non-government, non-state entities. There's only 3. So most prisons have something called an ombudsman. Y'all have heard this term. Those are located inside state departments, and some of them inside departments of corrections. I'm talking about external oversight mechanisms. There's only 3. And they do what they can with their legislative mandate, which is always at threat based on who is in office to be removed. And they only have recommendation power. They do have the right to go in and see, right? But there's usually, these organizations are very small. Correctional Association in New York has less than 10 staff, right? But they have the right to go in and inspect all New York all New York prisons, right? And so, but how long does that take? And then how long do we get the information back? And then how do we get it to the hands of the community-based organizations and organizers and activists on the ground so they can use it for their political actions, right? And so these are imperfect systems because these systems don't make money, right? These are all service organizations, and that's why. So you're saying, who's there to protect? Particularly in the child welfare space, there's none. There's not an oversight mechanism other than your general, your prosecuting attorney, your GA in any other place, right? You could file a complaint. You can file a class action suit. You can file, that's what you have in that space. Oversight of these departments that have so many of our women and children and moms and dads and fathers and sons and daughters have no oversight, right? And so, yes, you have found the problem. You've hit the nail on the head in these systems. And they're systems that are state funded with our tax dollars. We should be able to know more about what's going on inside these secretive, cordoned off, heterotopic spaces, right? So, yeah. Yeah.
So before we go, but you can still hear me.
You want this one?
No, it's okay. Before we go, I'm going to invite Dr. Nicole Fleetwood, who, as I mentioned earlier, she is the curator of the Marking Time exhibition that's throughout the Schomburg Center. She's going to give us a few words.
Congratulations. Thank you. Good evening. What a beautiful turnout to celebrate this incredible work. And I want to say it's so groundbreaking on many levels. One, I met Michelle in Mexico at a Decolonial Institute. How long were you out, Michelle? It was like...
I got out in August 2017, and we went the summer of 2018.
So, and it was incredible to talk to Michelle because Michelle was putting together so many pieces and thinking collectively, like thinking about like, what are ways that I can continue to collaborate with my friends who have not been released? What are ways that I can use resources and my networks to continue to amplify? But it was totally not in this top-down way whatsoever. It was like, what does it mean to collaborate radically across the carceral landscape? And your collaboration with Dr. Nelson and all your friends and folks inside is so inspiring. And I think I'm a professor at NYU in addition to being the curator of Marking Time, and I've been teaching in universities for 20 years, and rarely do we see people let go of the I to do the we in this radical, transformative way. And the only way that we can actually live in the world that I hope we want to cohabitate together is to let go of the I and live collectively a radical we, right? A radical we that does not allow millions of people to languish in cages. And then once they're released, to then continue to be stigmatized, not be able to have access to jobs, to homes, to health care, and the like. It's only through radical we that we can actually remake this world into the world that we want to be in. I invite you all to check out Marking Time, the exhibition that is in the gallery out front, and there's also 2 galleries upstairs, and to really engage with the storytelling that's taking place among this like incredible art making that most of it has happened in prison. About 2/3 of the artists were incarcerated, another third have not been engaged in prison, but they're really engaged with rethinking and reimagining the criminal legal system. And I want to say some highlights as related to the book include Gwendolyn Garth, who was incarcerated in Ohio, and is doing really amazing work in Cleveland now, rethinking communities, working through an organization that she created called the Kings and Queens. Do you know Gwendolyn through the Art for Justice Network? I think you all have met. Yeah, I think we have. And we're collaborating on an exhibition that's opening in Ohio, in my hometown of Hamilton, Ohio, actually, this weekend called Home Free. And then we have work by Sarah Bennett upstairs. Sarah was a criminal defense attorney for many years and then became a photographer, documenting women who've been sentenced to life in the state of New York, as well as Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, incredible video upstairs.
She's right here.
Mary! I did not see Mary. Mary is a beloved. Mary's work is upstairs. Mary just closed a solo show at the Brooklyn Museum where her work her work Ain't I a Woman, which really documents this long history of carceral captivity that she says from the minute that enslaved Africans were taken off the coast of Africa and brought to the Americas. We have been in prison, and that black women's reproduction and black women's sexual freedom have also been at the center of that captivity, the control of black women's bodies. Mary's Ain't I a Woman beautifully documents that, and you can access it on YouTube. There's also work by Sabo Elise Smith, Rowan Renee, that really thinks through captivity and the ways in which black families have been reconfigured. And you can think about that in Sable's work, and then Rowan Renee's thinking about the idea of how sex, this kind of label of the sex offender, as a gendered category and one that stigmatizes the entire family. There's also some collaborative work that's in this gallery out here with Women on the Rise, and they're a feminist collective that worked with young women and girls in Southwest Florida to really think about the ways in which captivity and criminalization affects young Black and Latinx people inside facilities and also on the streets. So please join me in congratulating the collective here who's present and the collective members who can't be present. And I really want to take a moment to say all of the spirit of everyone involved in this project are here. There they go. Right? And it's also all the lives that are documented through this long history. I want to also honor all that suffering and all those stories and acts of survival that you were able to really dig out of these archives and make available for us to. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
So on that note, again, thank you both for sharing with us, hearing these difficult stories and myths that we would think are too hard to believe, but we know better, and we know that they are. So We invite all of you. The books are available in our Schaumburg shop. And as mentioned, the exhibitions will be open for about 15 to 20 minutes. So do take advantage of that. And thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.